and welcome to this 4-part series on mission and discipleship from Kairos Connection. My name is Jennie Taylor, and I am going to be hosting this session with my friend Nick. So I am a missional leader in Kairos Connection and in my local church, and I'm married. I've got 3 amazing children, and I have been on this journey of mission and discipleship for, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years. About you, Nick?
Yep. My name is Nick Harding. I have the privilege of being the director of Kairos Connection. Have been leading KX for about 7 years. Before that, we moved to Liverpool to plant and then led Frontline Church. We did that for 24 years. Before that, in a previous life, I was a GP. I'm married with 4 girls and 8 grandchildren. So life is full and rich. But more than anything, I love this life, the life of being a missionary disciple, what some KX often describes as raising missionary disciples. That, for me, is the greatest joy, and I love being on this path.
Yeah, and I think that's really what KX is about, isn't it? What does it look like to raise missionary disciples? And these 4 videos will give you a little bit of a snapshot into the type of life that we are talking about. And so the 4 videos cover what it means to be a true disciple and the mission that we're on, the why of disciple making, the how of disciple making, and finally how we disciple people who are new to faith. So today we are going to be talking about the how of disciple making. So once we've covered what a disciple is, we've figured out the mission God's called us to, Nick, and we've got like the right motivation, how do we actually do this thing?
It's a great question, actually, Jen, and it's a question that I think not many people really fully get to grips with, because the idea of being a disciple maker, the idea of being on this journey of discipleship, remember we distinguish the two. Disciple making is the full journey of calling people into relationship with Jesus, cultivating them in their relationship with Jesus. That's the discipleship piece.
Yep.
And then commissioning them out of their relationship with Jesus to go and make more disciples. So, but how do we do that? That's the $64,000 question. And I hear a lot of churches talk about it, but very few churches or individual Christians, even leaders, have the slightest idea how to do it.
Yeah, and I think is that not often the frustration that we have, though, isn't it? I think as leaders and as individual Christians, is that, maybe somebody who seems interested in faith. You've kind of got an idea that you need to share Jesus with them, but you're like, I really don't know what to do. And that lack of confidence means that we just get so frustrated, doesn't it?
Absolutely, Jen. So we came up with this little idea called the Disciple Maker's Journey. Now, let me just say up front, we present it as a neatly packaged 1, 2, 3, 4 steps and a final question. But as you know and I know, Jen, life is not like that. It doesn't come in neat little packages.
It really doesn't. In fact, I don't know that I've ever used the Disciple Maker's Journey, and it's actually worked out in those 4 steps.
So rather than thinking them as steps you progress through 1, 2, 3, 4, it's kind of helpful to think about them as like landmarks on a journey. So, you can get from A to B a number of different ways.
Yeah.
But if I say to you, well, you're going to pass the Asda supermarket on way at this particular junction, and you're going to go past this primary school just before you get there. These are like the landmarks that you recognize them when you're there. You don't always have to go in exactly that sequence, because life is messy. Nobody fulfills our little neat packages or boxes. And so we also need to be very flexible in how we use this tool. But it is useful because it does provide these landmarks. It helps us to keep moving forward. And in particular, I find that many people get stuck when they think about making disciples. They kind of get so far, but they don't know what to do next.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the time I went into, this is an embarrassing story, by the way. I went into a petrol station, and I had this kind of bit of evangelistic fervor. I'm not quite sure where it came from. But I went to pay for my petrol. I said to the guy behind the desk, I said, do you know Jesus? And he looked at me completely bewildered, and he said, no. And I couldn't think of anything else to say. I was completely stuck. I didn't know what to do next. So, like any self-respecting Englishman, I paid for my petrol and I walked out. there is another end to that story, which is very exciting. You'll have to wait for another day to hear it. But we easily get stuck on the journey. Or we get so far in a relationship and we think, well, are they kind of open to Jesus or not? I don't really know.
Yeah.
How do I figure that out? Or we spend a long time in a friendship with someone. We're not really sure whether, these are the people that God's actually calling us to invest in. And we get stuck. So the disciple maker's journey helps us to keep moving forward and not get stuck. So, Jennie, let me just tell you what I think is the first step on this journey.
Okay.
So the first step on any disciple maker's journey is to connect with people. We call it connecting. Now, this really is not rocket science. I'm sorry if you were looking for something really clever. It's really simple. We have to make connections. That means saying hi to people.
So like really, really quite basic.
It's very basic. But there's a subtle twist on saying hi. Okay. And the subtle twist is, instead of just saying hi, you say, hi, how are you?
Okay.
How are you doing? Okay. We'll come back to that in a moment.
Okay.
Now for me, I'm a Jen, I'm a card-carrying introvert.
Definitely are.
I love my own space. I'm very happy in my own company. I don't need to be with other people to feel happy and content. Coffee shop and a good book, that's my idea of heaven. So people often ask me, well, doesn't this kind of exhaust you? Don't you feel like this is against your personality? Well, yes, there are times when I feel perhaps I'd rather be on my own, like I'm traveling on the train and I definitely wish I had 2 seats to myself. But because I love the mission that God has given us, I'll happily embrace the opportunities to make connections.
Okay.
So, for example, I'm invited to a Christmas party, as I usually am. I do still get occasional invitations, Jen.
I know. I do usually invite you to my Christmas party.
That is true. And rather than sit in a corner with one person who I think looks interesting, and I'm happy to talk to all night, which would be my introvert default,
Yeah.
I spend the evening going round the room, saying hi to as many people as I can. And hi and how are you? Because when I get to the how are you, it might just take me to the second landmark on the journey, which is what, Jen?
Which is chatting.
And you are very good at chatting, Jen. Jennie tells me she's an introvert, but I have to say she's the chattiest introvert I know.
Well, I think it's because I need introverted space to recharge by myself, preferably outside and not bothered by anybody. But I do also really love people, and I love getting to know new people and finding out about them. And so, yes, chatting is the second landmark. And I think some of us are obviously find that easier than others. And I'd say if you're finding it difficult, you just need to ask more questions. Come with like a good arsenal of questions.
That's my technique,
Is
Jen.
it? Yeah, what do people like to do? What do they like to do for fun? What's their favourite place to eat? What did they do recently that made them laugh? There are so many questions that we can ask along the way. But I think the challenge that I think most of us get to when we're chatting to people, whether they're new people or people we've known for a long time, is how do we moving those conversations from talking about natural things, your family, your holiday, what's happening in the world around you, to talking about spiritual things. How do we, the challenge is to move that conversation, isn't it? So that you can actually find out if this person is somebody who might be interested in conversations about faith. And we will talk about this later on when we talk about the principle of people of peace. But yeah, that next landmark is how are you chatting, and how do we get from talking about the weather, what we watched on TV, the great things, your kids or your grandkids have done recently, great show that you went to see, to talking about things that are spiritual.
You've mentioned the challenge at this particular stage, moving from natural to spiritual. And that reminds me that there is a challenge at the connecting stage as well.
Yeah, okay.
The challenge at the connecting stage is it's a mindset shift from thinking, I just need to make a few friends, which is the old friendship evangelism way of doing it. Just invest in a few friendships. Eventually, someone will probably come to Christ. In my experience, and in many, many people's experience, that never happens. So we need a mindset change at the connecting stage that says, instead of thinking of just making a few connections, think about making dozens or even hundreds of new connections over the space of a year, say, because you never know which one of them's going to lead to a conversation that leads to greater engagement with the gospel.
Yeah. And also that thing about moving from few to many isn't really as difficult as it sounds, because you're not saying, are you? You need to make deep and long-lasting friendships with all these people.
No.
But the idea is that actually by saying hi and how are you to more people, you increase the chances of meeting those people who are actually interested in, first of all, chatting with you because they'd like to talk to you, and second of all, moving that chatting from natural conversations to spiritual conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
absolutely.
We've connected with them, we've chatted with them, and we're remembering these are just landmarks. What's the third landmark, Nick?
So the third landmark is inviting. Again, none of this is rocket science, is it?
No, not really.
It's really basic. And what we are inviting people into, if they've shown an interest, particularly if they've shown an interest in spiritual things, and we're going to come back to that, then we want to invite them into a deeper relationship where they can get to know us, and hopefully we'll be a good reflection of the good news of Jesus as they look at our lives. We're inviting them into relationship, and probably that'll start with like a cup of coffee or something like that. I remember a good friend of mine who now lives in New Zealand, but when I first met him, ran an engraving business, and I was getting the nameplate for my medical practice engraved in red perspex. Everybody else had brass.
You just wanted to be a bit different.
I had to be a bit different, yeah. So along with the red kickers I wore at the time. And he took an interest because it was a bit different. And so, we made a connection. We got chatting. And because he seemed to enjoy chatting with me in the relationship, I asked him if he'd like to go out for a coffee sometime. That's all it was. Let's go for a coffee to the local coffee shop. And he said, yeah, sure. So we went out for a coffee together. And that began a relationship where he started to explore faith more. We talked about Christian things quite a lot. It led to an invitation then to a Bible study where he could explore faith more deeply. He could wrestle with some of the big questions. That then led to an invitation to an evangelistic event. And it was after that, sitting round our kitchen table, that he finally gave his life, he and his wife gave his life to Jesus. There were a series of invitations along the way that helped him to come to faith and to start on the journey of a disciple.
I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because within that, you didn't stop chatting, did you? Or stop connecting. You went backwards and forwards, didn't you? Between inviting him to some things, chatting about spiritual things with him, inviting him to something else again. And I think that story is a really good example of how you move around the disciple maker's journey from one point to another. And sometimes, you're going backwards and forwards and side to side because people are complex, aren't they?
Absolutely.
And we generally don't follow those nice, neat packages that we like to put them in.
And the other thing is, of course, is the challenge at the inviting stage, because each stage has its own challenge, whether it's few to many, natural to spiritual. The challenge at this stage is going from social connection to spiritual engagement, to spiritual journey. And so, it could be a Bible study like I took this young guy on. It could be an Alpha course or Christianity Explored. It could be to an Easter or Christmas service. It's like an invitation that takes them out of the realm of just social contact into spiritual journey.
Yeah.
So what happens next, Jen? Assuming that someone like my friend comes to faith and starts to grow as a disciple, what's the next phase the next landmark on the journey?
Well, I think the next landmark is multiplying, because when we start life as a disciple, right from the beginning, we are thinking about helping people to become disciple makers, because that's what Jesus has called us to.
That's the mission.
That's the mission, exactly. And regardless of where somebody is on their journey with Jesus, there are opportunities for them to start to explore and engage and get on board with that adventure of disciple making. And I think that in different relationships, it will look different, but it's going to be things like giving people opportunities, helping them to be encouraged along the way as they try out new things and are supported by the community around them. So there's a lady in our community at the moment, and she hasn't lived in the UK for very long, and she works at a local hospital. And she is being discipled by me, and I am helping her to stretch out to become a disciple maker. And for her, that's looked like some really small things, like praying for people in work when they were unwell. One of her colleagues was sick, and she was like, I'm not really sure what to do. And I was like, well, why don't you just offer to pray with him? And she was so surprised when he said yes. But she's come away from that encouraged, because she's continuing that cycle. First of all, she made a connection with him. She started chatting with him, and she moved that chatting from natural to spiritual.
So you're taking her around the same journey?
Around that same journey again, yeah.
Okay.
So, when it comes to, if we have like some, an Easter event coming up, or even just a social event, when I speak to her, I'm going to say to her, well, is that someone that you could invite along the way? Because I want her to also move around that same journey,
And to have the joy.
Yeah, because it's actually really good fun.
Yeah.
Okay, so we connect with people, and we move from few connections to many.
Before we move on,
okay,
let me finish my story about the engraver.
Oh, okay, yeah, go on.
So he'd got to this stage of starting to follow Jesus. He was part of our church community, and he was starting to think about, well, how do I become? He didn't have the language then, but how do I start to do the thing that you've done for me?
Yeah.
Which is to help others on the same journey. And because he ran an engraving business, he had about 12 employees. And so he gradually started to share his story of what God was doing in his life with the people who he worked with. Yeah. And over the next years, I think at least 3 of them came to faith. So
How amazing is that?
From connecting to chatting to inviting, started to multiply and bring others to faith and see them too become disciple makers.
That's wonderful, isn't it? It is.
And that was so exciting for me to see that happening for him.
I think that's it, isn't it? I think sometimes we forget that because we get to do this in community with other Christians, we get to share the joy of disciple making together.
Absolutely. There is a final piece to the jigsaw,
Yes.
Jen. Okay. And it's the magic sauce that will stop anybody getting stuck on this journey. The magic sauce is a simple question. And at any stage along the journey, if you're not sure what to do next with a particular person maybe you've at least connected with, or maybe you've chatted with, or perhaps you've invited them out for a coffee or to a meal, and you're not sure what to do next, you just have to ask the "What's next, Lord?" question.
What's next, Lord?
It's really simple. It's that simple. So, you've got a friend, you've taken them out for a coffee, they seem to be interested, but you don't know what to do next. So you just say, Lord, what's next for this particular person? And in my experience, and many, many others, God will drop a thought into your mind almost immediately. Send them a text. Invite them around for a meal. Ask if they want to go to the football.
Yeah.
Take them to the pub. Send them a book. Send them a link to a YouTube clip that deals with faith issues, or invite them on an Alpha course. There's always going to be something that drops into your mind when you just ask the question, what's next, Lord? And you never need to get stuck on this journey with anybody. And there are people that, you don't lose touch with them, but you may invest less time with them because they're not particularly interested in what your life's about. And that is always going to limit a relationship. But for those who are really showing more interest and you want to know what's next, just ask the "What's next, Lord?" question. Bingo, it opens up again and you keep moving forward.
That's wonderful. Nick, earlier when we talked about the chatting portion of the disciple maker's journey and that challenge of moving from natural conversations to spiritual conversations, I mentioned that we were going to talk about something that would really help. This principle of people of peace. So can you tell us who are people of peace and how do you find them?
Okay, I'd love to, Jen, because I think this is a real game changer for us in terms of seeing people become followers of Jesus. So the whole purpose of the disciple maker's journey is to try and find the people that the Father is already working in, because Jesus only did what he saw the Father doing. That's where he invested his time and energy. That's how he raised 12 world-changing disciples in 3 years. So if Jesus operated like that, then what was the secret? What was the principle that he was working with? And he gives that secret principle to his disciples in Luke 10. He sends them out to bring good news to the people in the towns and villages, and he gives them the keys as to how to find what he calls the man of peace, or what we call people of peace. And it's about giving that person your blessing. It's about offering them the shalom, the well-being, the blessing of God on their lives, and seeing who responds, who welcomes you in to their home, and offers you hospitality. So we talk about people of peace being those who kind of lean in. When you start to talk about spiritual things, they lean in. They open their heart. Often they'll open their homes. And Jesus said, that's the one you stay with. So you don't cast other people aside, but you invest the biggest part of your time with these people called people of peace. So we've come up with 3 B's, Jen, which are a simple way to find people of peace.
Okay.
And you'll see the overlap here with the disciple maker's journey. Okay. Number 1 is be friendly. Okay, that's the say hi, how you doing? Be friendly. Be friendly to everyone you meet. When you're on the train and you're sitting next to someone, say hi, how you doing? Where are you going?
Yeah.
Be friendly. The second one is be curious. And you touched on this for people who haven't got a lot of small talk.
Yeah.
It's be curious, show a genuine interest in the other person. I find people actually really fascinating. And I love to ask loads and loads of questions. Because if you ask enough questions and you're genuinely interested, which is a sign of love, then eventually, quite probably, they will ask you a question about yourself. At that point, it's really simple to kind of segue into your story. I mean, the way I do that is just by saying, do you know, that's a really good question when they ask me about myself. That's a great question. Can I just tell you my story? I've never yet had anybody ever say no. So being ready with my story is the key. So it's be friendly, be curious, and be ready. And remember, in the armor of God in Ephesians 6, Paul talks about the shoes. People often think about it as the shoes of the gospel or the shoes of the gospel of peace. Actually, it's the shoes of the readiness of the gospel of peace. It's being ready. And so for me, being ready means being ready to tell my story. And, we've got a whole training on this, Jen, haven't we, about how to tell your 6-word story. I'll just tell you, my 6 words are buried alive, answered prayer, amazing adventure. So I'd say, tell you what, can I just tell you my story? And when I was 15, I was actually buried alive under 100 weights of sand. And as I was about to go unconscious, I had this amazing experience of the presence of God, this complete sense of peace. Even though I knew I might die, I was on the beach, we dug this 6-foot hole, me and my sister, we were buried alive as the sand collapsed in on our hole. But because I'd given my life to Christ 3 years earlier, as a 12-year-old, somehow this peace of God enveloped me. And although I didn't die, clearly, I thought I might, but I was peaceful. And I thought, oh my goodness, how did I experience that peace in a moment when I should have been panicking, anxious, fighting, angry, whatever? It had to be God, which took me right back to an answered prayer. So buried alive on a beach took me right back to have an answered prayer as a 7 or 8-year-old, praying I'd come top of the class. Really selfish prayer that only a 7 or 8-year-old would pray. God, in his mercy, answered that prayer. It was the only time in that school I ever came top of the class. And I thought, oh my goodness, God has answered my prayer. So when I heard about Jesus as a 12-year-old at a summer camp in the fields of Norfolk, I heard about how he died for me, how he had risen from the dead, and he wanted to be with me forever and live with me and give me his purpose for my life. I thought, yes, I want that.
Yeah.
Made that very simple decision, asked him to come into my life. So now as a 15-year-old, I'm making sense of all of this, think, okay, this is because of that. And as an adult, I want to say it's just been the most amazing adventure. I've just tried to follow and figure out God's plan, follow his path for my life, and just watch him unfold situations, open doors. Our move from Bristol to Liverpool, which I've mentioned before, was an amazing adventure. The move out of general practice into the stuff I do now with churches, another amazing adventure. getting married and staying married to the same person for 46 years. That's quite a miracle, isn't it?
It is, but it's also an adventure.
It is an adventure,
Yeah.
absolutely. So many things, and seeing people physically healed from physical health conditions. There's this sense of, wow, I wouldn't miss that for the world. And I've been on that journey since I was a 12-year-old boy. And I want to say I wouldn't swap it for anything. And then I'd normally just say, does that make any sense to you? Have you ever prayed? Or, do you have any faith experience? Or just to open up the conversation a bit more. Mm-hmm. And that's the point at which I watch their body language. They either lean in because they're really interested, or they kind of look away because they're a bit bored and disinterested. Gives me a real key as to whether they are likely to be people of peace or not.
Brilliant.
But I know your story will be completely different to mine, Jen.
Well, yeah, definitely. So my 6 words would be rejected, alone, powerful prayer, family, belonging. So mine make less sense than yours, but they're great for me because they help me to they're like the points for me to hang my story on so that I don't get lost along the way.
Like coat pegs.
Yeah, like coat pegs, totally. So for me, I grew up in a Christian family. So I'd been hearing about Jesus. Well, I think I must have gone to church the first time when I was probably a week old. So I'd been hearing about Jesus all the time. But I also came from a broken home. My parents divorced when I was about 4. And that was very, very impactful on me, particularly because I felt very, very rejected by my father. I never used to see him. He wouldn't visit me. He used to come and he would visit my siblings and he'd bring presents for them. And I would always get left out. And so I felt very, very rejected at home by my family. And I felt like nobody understood me, I used to wish that I was adopted and that hopefully these just weren't really my family and that was the problem. I think lots of young people feel like that from time to time, don't they? But it really impacted me, and it meant that as a teenager I looked everywhere for acceptance and for fulfillment. And I was such a people pleaser. I would do absolutely anything to maintain relationships, and that was really very, very destructive. And unbeknownst to me, while this was going on, and I was like, I suppose, living in a way that did not reflect what I really wanted, drinking, going out, getting involved in loads of really destructive relationships. But while that was happening, one of my aunts had been praying for me. And as it turns out, she's been praying for me my whole life, and she still prays for me now.
Isn't that so often the case, Jen?
I think it is, isn't it? And basically, we had this one day, I'd gone to a family party and she was there, and I was just in a terrible place. I was alone. I felt like no one loved me. Nobody cared about me. And although I knew about Jesus, I really thought that because my life was such a mess, that he wouldn't be interested in me. And she didn't know that any of this was happening. And I was just sat down, having something to eat. She came alongside me and she just turned around to me and she said, "Jennie, it doesn't matter what you've done. God loves you and he will always accept you." And I just completely burst into tears. And we had a lovely conversation about God's grace towards me. And I rededicated my life to Jesus, and it has never been the same since, because what I have experienced since that point was this change in identity, recognizing that I am part of a family where I am loved, where I'm accepted, where I belong, and was introduced to these people that I'm not related to by blood, but who will love me completely, who support me, and really showed me what it meant like to be part of a family that is healthy, that's supportive, that cares for you, and that loves you. And so when I tell other people my story, I would normally follow up by saying, "Well, yeah, does that make any sense to you? Yeah. Have you had an experience like that? Have you ever had an experience of faith?"
And people love a story, don't they?
They do, yes.
One of the reasons people never say no when you say, "Can I tell you my story?" is most people are just nosy.
They just want to know about you. I think you're right. Yeah. That's how we get to that space of thinking about people of peace. Be friendly, be curious, and be ready. So we are, as we have done in all of these sessions, going to finish on those 2 discipleship questions. What is it that God is saying to you? and what are you going to do about it? So we're thinking about, how has God spoken to me through this session? What do I need to reflect on? Where do I see myself? Where am I on that disciple maker's journey? And what is God saying to you? So what are you going to do about it? How might you respond? What could you invest in? What do you need to spend time thinking and praying about next?
Great. That's fantastic, Jen. Thank you.